Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rowan Arar. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Law, Societies, and Justice. It's my absolute pleasure today to be able to introduce Austin Coker. And I'm going to go ahead and read Austin's bio. But before that, let me just confirm that I pressed mute on this computer and we're still okay with what I just did. I could hear my introduction coming at me, so I didn't want that for. Okay.
Who's checking?
Can you hear us okay? Oh, I'm going to.
Yes, everybody can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay. Sorry about that false start. We'll just start over again. Hi, and welcome to the CSDE seminar series. My name is Rowan Arar. I'm a professor in the Law, Societies, and Justice Department, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Austin Coker today. Dr. Austin Coker is a geographer and assistant research professor at the Transactional Research Access Clearinghouse, also known as TRAC, a research institute at Syracuse University that uses Freedom of Information Act requests to study the federal government. Key areas of Coker's current research at TRAC include mapping and analyzing large federal data sets related to immigration detention, enforcement and deportation, and the immigration court system, and trends within the federal, criminal, and civil courts. Coker's research interests focus on the political and legal geographies of racialized policing practices, local immigration enforcement, and the immigration court system. His ongoing work interrogates the legal rationalities and everyday practices of producing illegalized immigrants throughout North America and Europe. So please join me in welcoming Professor Coker up here. We are so happy to have you.
Okay, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you to CSDE for having me out. This has been already a fantastic visit here. The conversations with students, undergraduate, graduate, and my colleagues, faculty here have been incredible, and I've learned so much already. So I'm really excited about this and the discussion that hopefully this will prompt. The title of the talk is Overcoming Institutional Closure in Immigration Research, although as we were getting started, we thought maybe a better title would be Hacking the Government, because that's kind of what this talk is about. It's about how to get data out of institutions that are resistant to oversight and accountability. So as Professor Arar said, I'm a professor at TRAC at Syracuse University. TRAC has been around. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of TRAC and myself before I get into the talk, just so you have a little bit of context for where we're going with this if you haven't heard of TRAC before. So TRAC has been around since 1989. It was founded by a professor and a New York Times journalist who both of whom had been using Freedom of Information Act requests, public records requests basically, to do different kinds of research and reporting, and decided to team up and create a research institute that really focused on this at Syracuse University. By the way, public records requests, anyone in this room, in fact, anyone in the world, can submit a public records request to the US federal government. There is no citizenship requirement or nationality requirement, so anyone can do it and ask for records from the federal government. And that's what we do. We spend a lot of time using the Freedom of Information Act to obtain digital records from the federal government, turn those into data, and then make those available to the public, as well as do all kinds of research on it. Immigration is our main focus, and my focus as an immigration scholar is obviously immigration, but we do actually a number of areas of research on the federal government, including IRS, federal criminal prosecution, civil litigation, and so forth. We're a pretty small team. There's just really one of the seven is retired, so there's really 6 of us. It's a very small team given how much data we process, but we use technology to our advantage to really capitalize on the amount of data that we receive. My work, as we've already mentioned, as a researcher, really focuses on immigration enforcement and the whole deportation pipeline. Even though I do a lot of data work now, actually my background is more in qualitative and critical research. But as you'll see, in fact, understanding these institutions from a grounded ethnographic perspective is actually key to making sense of the mess of data that we get from the federal government. So the title of the talk has to do with overcoming institutional closure. So I want to just give a little bit of a preamble to the fact that as researchers studying a variety of social issues, especially for those of us studying immigration, we often come into contact with institutions that would rather not be studied. Particularly those of us who adopt what Laura Nader called a studying up approach to the law, which means instead of studying the populations that are targeted for state violence, I'm actually interested in studying the institutions that create, perpetuate, and reproduce state violence itself. The challenge with doing that work is that immigrant detention centers and immigration courts and deportation offices and ICE offices around the country are not thrilled to have a researcher come into the office and take notes and see what's going on. There's all kinds of restrictions and barriers to doing that kind of research. And so some of us have tried to conceptualize and theorize and create different kinds of methodologies for how we study these institutions when they would rather not be studied. The way that I'll present in this talk that we do that is using public records requests, although in kind of a quirky, persistent way that tries to get around some of those institutional closures. And that's sort of the target of the talk is institutional closures. The detention centers, courts, and so forth are effectively closed to most people unless they're the ones targeted for that state violence. So I want to start with an example that paints a picture of what we do at TRAC and why, how we try to make that work matter. So a few years ago during the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security created a policy and a program along the US-Mexico border that undermined the human rights of migrants and refugees seeking asylum along the border. In January of 2019, the program began, and the program operated and continued until 2021. It was challenged in court many times and eventually eliminated. But the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, effectively dramatically changed asylum processing along the border. Asylum is a human right. Migrants who come to the border who are fleeing violence and persecution have the right to request asylum and to have their case heard by an asylum officer or an immigration judge and to get a determination on their case. But this program changed that processing in a very particular way. It used to be that migrants would come to the border, cross the border, either at a port of entry or cross unlawfully, ostensibly between ports of entry, be arrested and perhaps detained, given what's called a credible fear interview, or basically a preliminary screening interview. And if they passed, they would be allowed to go on to have their case heard in front of an immigration judge inside the United States. MPP did something quite devious, actually. It still technically allowed migrants to seek asylum in the court system, but rather than allowing migrants into the country to do so, it forced those migrants to remain in Mexico, which is why the program is sometimes called Remain in Mexico, in northern Mexico in areas that were quite dangerous, and forced them to wait for long periods of time. There's lots of reports of migrants being extorted, kidnapped, even killed, while waiting for their asylum hearing. And that fact, there's two keys here that's really crucial for us in this talk. One is they were placed into the immigration court system, even though they were forced to remain outside of the country. So they had a pending case inside the country, forced to remain outside. And we'll come back to why that fact is so important. As a result of MPP, a variety of camps, refugee camps, informal camps sprung up along the US-Mexico border, such as this one in Matamoros, that became a symbol of the failed program and sparked concerns about the humanitarian crisis that the policy created. We at TRAC were able to, however, and I should say, not only all of this, but the Trump administration was extremely reluctant to share any information about how the program was actually working. Because the big question that arises from this is, just empirically, are these migrants who ostensibly have hearings in immigration court, are they actually able to get to their court hearing across the border? Are they safe? Are they willing to wait in these dangerous conditions? So we at TRAC were able to actually jump on this issue right away and begin tracking the cases that were in immigration court every single month to show how many new cases were added in light of the Trump administration not sharing that information. But not only that, being able to share all kinds make available to the public all kinds of information about the language of the asylum seekers, their gender, their nationality, and what actually happened with their asylum cases. So we were able to roll this out pretty quickly, and I'll explain how we were able to do this and why we were able to do this in the talk. As a result of this as well, we were able to be a part of some of the important critical reporting that showed the really dangerous effects that this had on asylum seekers, such as one family that Mother Jones, reporter Fernandez Chibara, wrote about. And we worked with her actually to provide some of the data that we had received from the federal government to show that, in fact, these asylum seekers were much, much less likely to get attorneys, and also much, much less likely to get asylum. So asylum seekers, 72,000 in total, who were in the system, of those, less than 2% were ever granted asylum, compared to about 35% were granted asylum for those asylum seekers who were allowed into the country before the program. So quite a dramatic difference, and this data actually played a major role in hearings by Congress that were seeking at the time to sort of challenge the program and hold the administration accountable. So how are we able to do this, and how are we able to respond so quickly to such a dramatic policy change on the ground? The way we're able to do that is through FOIA. So I'll give you an overview of how we work, and then we'll dive into some of the details here. So we use, as I mentioned, we use Freedom of Information Act requests to get data from the federal government. Once we get that data, which takes a long time, we have to do a tremendous amount of detective work to understand what it means. Because we are typically getting data from the federal government that the government would rather us not have, and which does not come with the user manual, and there is no customer support hotline. So when we get this data, we have to make sense of it ourselves, often with field names that are confusing and internal codes that we don't necessarily understand. We also validate it. Just because the government gives you something as in response to a public records request does not mean that they've given you accurate data. In fact, they mess it up quite frequently. So we very carefully validate the data that we get. And then we turn that data into, we do scholarly research with it, we produce reports, and we produce some online interactive tools to make as much of this data available to the whole public. So if you want to go in and look at the data, you can do that for yourself. So what I want to talk about now is more deeper into the process of how we work. And I want to conceptualize the methodology that we've developed over the last 30 years as what I want to call FOIA as method, or FOIA as a research method. The FOIA as method language comes from the book several years ago, Border as Method, which is a very critical read of Borders, if some of you have read that, but FOIA as method. And what I mean by that is the use of public records requests as part of an interdependent, and that's crucial, it's not just FOIA, it's typically multiple research strategies, but as an interdependent set of approaches to obtain research data from the federal government, while also generating new knowledges about the state in the process. And that's going to be key here. It's not just about getting data from the government, and as we'll see, I actually want to challenge the idea that FOIA somehow produces some truth about the government, that the government holds this truth behind closed doors, and then you ask for it, and then the light shines open and you get truth. That's not how that works. But what it does do is, even regardless of the accuracy and reliability of the data, actually the process of it as a method teaches us a lot about how the state works. So why would the government keep secrets from the public? Cicella Bach has a fantastic book on secrets where she theorizes secrecy as a kind of intentional concealment and tries to think about conflicts over secrecy as actually conflicts over power. And I think this is a really important message to take away from what some strategic uses of FOIA can do for research is that it not only illuminates, and it's not just part of a project of transparency, but actually a struggle over knowledge and of power within the state. My colleague Margaret Quokka, who's written the only scholarly book on FOIA, talks about the fact that that even from a general sort of democratic perspective, that the public views government action differently when it knows what motivated and influenced it. So something like, if you recall, family separation during the Trump administration, when parents were separated from their children at the border as part of a punitive strategy. Initially, the Department of Justice said that they were, Jeff Sessions, who was AG, Attorney General at the time, said this was simply a side effect of a routine enforcement policy. Years later, 18 months, 24 months later, and lots of public records requests and lots of interviews, we find out that actually Jeff Sessions knew all along that this was going to cause this hardship, and it was in fact the point, and that does change how the public views things. So FOIA is not necessarily inherently a check on power, but in some cases, in the right context, it can be. As a result of that, FOIA as a research method is not value neutral in itself, but is actually quite a contentious research methodology, because this challenges the state's purported monopoly on its systems of knowledge, and in this case, its internal systems of control. Now, my first introduction to FOIA was actually state-level FOIA, not federal, around a project in North Carolina where I worked at the ACLU of North Carolina to obtain traffic checkpoint data that was purportedly value neutral, but was actually tied to some immigration enforcement policies that made it unlawful for undocumented immigrants to get driver's licenses. So checkpoints sort of turned into this proxy immigration battle at the local scale, especially in North Carolina, where checkpoints, this sort of policing strategy was used. And by getting those records through public records requests, digitizing them and mapping them, we actually learned a lot about how racialized policing works at the local scale, and found actually that there was quite a reasonably high degree of correspondence between where these checkpoints were happening and Latino communities. And when they weren't Latino communities, one of the interesting things that we heard both on the ground and we saw in the data was they were actually around new home construction. Some employers were reported their employees wouldn't show up to work because there would be checkpoints outside of the new home construction. Not only that, but in driving, I drove every single one of those checkpoints that you see. I drove every single one of them and took 360-degree photos of every single one of them and interviewed folks, and it was quite a big project. But one of the things that we found too was that many of them were outside of rural trailer parks. And if you're familiar with the social geography of North Carolina, rural trailer parks are predominantly laborers and often Latino laborers, not exclusively, but predominantly. So that was my first entry into FOIA and public records requests. And it's a good example of what I would conceptualize as kind of an extractivist model of using FOIA, where this was a situation where we had to sort of fight with the local sheriffs and the local law enforcement agencies. We filed a public records request. We fought the agencies on it. We got the records, and then we did something with it. So you file a FOIA request. Maybe you have to litigate. Maybe you have to fight. Then you get records. Right? This is kind of a traditional model of using FOIA, and it reflects the first project that I did, which is fine. But what I want to sort of elaborate on is that this transparency model is actually not what I mean by FOIA as method. So using a transparency model that we sort of use at TRAC is quite a bit more complicated and strategic, and some of you in the room who I know have been engaged in maybe some FOIA and public records requests, maybe that you're familiar with this. If you're not, just note that that this is going to look a bit more complicated, but it's hopefully still legible. So in that first initial model that I showed you, you just write a FOIA request and you send it off. In fact, if you use FOIA as more of a strategic, critical, studying up the state kind of model of research method, in fact, what we often do is we actually spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time studying government data systems so that I understand how the government data systems are structured. so that when I ask for information, I know exactly what I'm asking for. It also requires a lot of content area expertise. This is why I focus on immigration FOIAs. I don't do FOIAs for other areas because I don't understand it. But if I'm interested in understanding a particular part of the immigration court system or the immigrant detention system, I've spent enough time in those institutions that I know the forms that are used, I know I know the process that people go through, and I can more specifically write public records requests that really specifically say, I want this information, I want it from this place, I want it in this format. And it also requires institutional analysis. So, like I said, I've spent time in detention centers, I've interviewed, 200 or so local sheriffs and police officers, seen hundreds of, immigration and asylum hearings and immigration courts. And all this feeds into the conversation, feeds into the process of requesting information from the government. So once that initial stage is done, what I'm interested in doing is sending a kind of probing FOIA request, which is typically relatively simple and typically is clearly referenced enough that I know what I'm going to get back before I get it back. I can be pretty sure that I know what's there, and that way when I do get it back, remember that process of validation I mentioned that we go through with all the data? This is something that I'm making this FOIA request in such a way that I know what I'm going to get, so I know that I can validate it, right? After that, though, and after a couple of those maybe, we might send escalating FOIA requests, which means we're not just asking for maybe summary records, but we might be asking for highly detailed records. And when I say records here, at least for us, a lot of people use FOIA and public records requests to get documents, paper documents, or even paper documents that have been scanned in. We actually don't typically go after paper records. We go after the data systems that the government relies on, as we'll see in a second. So I may be filing escalating FOIA requests that are more detailed, they're asking for more information, but by this point, I also know what I'm going to get, or I know what I should get. Sometimes this escalating FOIA request process may require litigation, so you may actually have to sue. And we were having a conversation over coffee before this about how reluctant, unfortunately, scholars are to go head to head with the US government, both because our institutions don't always incentivize it, sometimes they actively disincentivize it, or because we just don't know what to do or we're scared. And actually there's something to be said here for having the persistence and enough thick skin to actually take government agencies to task when it comes to releasing records that are lawfully required to be released to the public. Eventually, what we will do at TRAC is we'll file a really comprehensive FOIA request that asks for everything, like everything in all caps. And not only that, but we want all the records and we want them repeatedly. I want all the records about detention, I want them every single month. That's actually what we're going for at the end of the day, and you'll see why. This almost always requires FOIA litigation, almost always. So it's something that one has to think about. After, and really at each stage, but after each stage and as an ongoing practice, this also requires all kinds of commitments to storing the data, validating the data, analyzing the data, and then making it available in some way, either through scholarly publications, reports, or some of the interactive tools we have. And this is all really key because what we want to do is every step of the process, we want to turn that around into something. So even that first stage of probing FOIA requests, if we get back some good information, we'll write something up and we'll publish it and we'll make it available to the public because we want other people to know. So every point of this, we want to try to make it count. There are some real barriers and also some real benefits to this FOIA as method process. One is there are really high staffing demands. Now, there's just 6 of us at TRAC, so that's not a lot of people. There are a lot of organizations who are trying to do what we do and have 3 or 4 times the number of people. But what we've been able to do, we still have really high staffing demands because of the technical expertise and that we hire for. So we're a very tailored team and a very specialized team in terms of what we do. High technology demands. I mean, we take up a lot of server space at the Syracuse University Green Supercomputing Center, whatever it is. That's real. That has a cost associated with it if you have to buy that on the market. or, hopefully like us, we're able to, use the university resources, but there are demands. This all requires FOIA expertise, which is in itself its own domain of expertise, even in addition to immigration. These often require long timelines. Remember that last slide where you've got multiple, right? Those are years, to get all the way to the point where you're asking for comprehensive data, and that's a timeline that not everybody is comfortable with. And if you're doing a master's thesis or PhD, that's not a long enough timeline to get there. In fact, most single grants are not going to let you get there, in the grant timeline. So you really have to think about how to bite off pieces, along the way. You have to make friends with attorneys who are going to take on your cases, pro bono. So we have those relationships, or you have to have some sort of other capital or relationships that will help you do that. And you really have to be committed to the work. A lot of groups sort of like take on little pieces of what we do from time to time, and then sort of fade away just because people sort of, I think, underestimate how much time it takes in terms of funding. However, there are enormous benefits to this, including creating really detailed knowledge bases of how state systems work at a really granular level that allow for, remember the MPP thing, that allow for some really precise and very substantive critiques to be made, as well as allow us as scholars to think critically and theoretically about how the administrative state actually works in the contemporary era. It also means if you get to that final stage where you're getting comprehensive data and you're getting it regularly, it means that you always have that data on hand. You don't have to wait until something happens to then send in a FOIA request. But if you wait until something happens to ask for all the data, it's too long. It's going to be too long before you get the data. You're not going to answer that question. And of course, it allows us to theorize these things and to really challenge. Well, I won't get into that last point, but there's a lot of benefits to this process. Okay, so let's. So for example, I started off with MPP and what we were able to do with that. The question is, okay, we've made it through that process. How do we actually do that work of exposing the violence that MPP ultimately perpetrated on asylum seekers by effectively preventing them from requesting asylum? Well, the result of that FOIA as method process, we do have one shining example of that, which is the immigration court's case data system, which we've now had access to for several years. It took TRAC 10 years to get this data, but we now actually have comprehensive data on the immigration court system at a highly granular level that we get every single month, and we're able to do new research on all the time. Let's give you a little bit about the file itself. It's huge.
Austin, can I just ask you a quick clarification?
Yes.
So what you're saying is that in that last FOIA step,
Yes.
you're asking for ongoing,
Yes.
not just like that you've gotten like years of data, but you're asking for ongoing.
That's right.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. I like it. Right. It's a huge file. Some people in this room I know have opened up this file. It's publicly available on the Department of Justice website. But it's huge. And I get calls and emails every day. Oh, what's this table? How do you figure this out? What's, that kind of thing. And, I don't have time to answer all of those questions, but they're there. Interesting. It's taken years of work to understand this data file. And I realize you can't see that. But what's down there says so we typically get it about a week or 2 weeks after the end of the month. So literally yesterday, we just got the updated data through the end of October for all the court records. Now, I'm going to skip over some of this, but what I really want to point out here, I won't go into too much detail, but I just want to say that given the massive size of this file and the granularity of this file, it is actually quite important at this point in our thinking to shift from thinking about FOIA as a methodology to actually thinking critically about what data is and what a database is. Because it affects how you read, interpret, analyze, and write about government data. And so in a simple sense, a database is a set of tables that are linked together. And the nature of that linking together means that there's kind of, I don't want to say infinite, but there's kind of infinite ways of combining this data. So the research isn't just like you open up a spreadsheet and you search for something, or you create a pivot table. The analysis with millions and tens of millions of records requires large computing power and writing programs, essentially programs, to do analysis and stitch the data together in different ways to do the analysis. So it requires some expertise, but also let's just remember that what goes into these government data systems is not the truth about the world. There's a process of translation that happens between what happens in the real world, so to speak, and what actually gets encoded in government databases. And so we should also be mindful that databases are themselves an apparatus of state power. And that's what we're looking at. These relations of power that exist in the world, white supremacy, border enforcement, immigration controls, all of this are partly produced in and through these sorts of systems, databases that produce and reproduce knowledge about what counts as an individual and who counts as undocumented or deportable or a citizen or an asylum seeker. I have some additional resources here. I'm not going to I'm going to skip over this if you don't mind. But just want to emphasize that the data that we're looking at here, unlike the census data or let's say Center for Disease Control data, this data was not produced for us to see. Census data is collected in order to share with the public, you could say. You could say, well, some of what CDC has done is obviously, they've hid things over the years too, right? But there's certain parts of what these agencies do, which is intentionally designed to be public data. We are not getting that kind of data. We're getting data that just keeps offices running and keeps the border enforcement apparatus functioning and keeps the courts churning out undocumented bodies. This is what's underlying that. And so it's just important to keep that in mind and be critical about that. So we get the file. My colleagues are working on this today. I am not because I'm here. My colleagues are validating the data, of course. We find errors all the time. So we have to validate it or we'll produce wrong stuff. We will add it to the data in our servers, which we keep a historical data set of. So if we ever want to go back and see what the data looked like at any point in the past, we can do that. And we'll end up with a new comprehensive court data set, probably by Monday or Tuesday. I suppose Michael will get to it. And then we'll use that to feed into all of the different things that we've created over time to make this data legible. Not everything in there is interesting or valuable to most people. A lot of it has research value, but some of it's less legible to people who are coming. So we produce all kinds of interactive tools that try to make that available. One of the things that we do with new research, however, and this gets to the MPP discussion, is this data set is dynamic. So it is, to use a technical term, not hermeneutically sealed. The meanings and interpretations within the database itself are not entirely foreclosed, even if the government would like it to be. So in fact, all kinds of data in there change over time. Codes change over time, fields are added and taken away. There are some unpredictable things, there are surprising things, and of course, it reflects the policy landscape, which is why we were able to identify the problems with MPP. Because if you go back to that third or fourth slide, remember, everyone who was put in MPP was perplexingly put into the immigration court system. Even though they were outside of the United States, they were given notices to appear, which put you in immigration court. And remember, the data that we were just looking at, that's immigration court data. So we were able to go in and see, oh, there's these new codes that have been added since the start of MPP. And since we already get comprehensive data and we get it every single month, we were able to find it right away and jump on it and spend the time to do it and then connect the data to the public using this kind of tool. So you can still go in today, even though the program is expired at this point, you can still go in and see the people who are in it and what happened to them, their nationality, their hearing attendance, and so forth. And so even after policies themselves go away, the data that we have and the tools that we create still serve as a kind of digital archive of the state long after those state policies have gone away. We do all kinds of other things, and I'll wrap up here with just a couple fun slides. We do all kinds of other things with this data. I wrote a legal brief 2.5 years ago, which convinced the immigration courts to give us zip code data for immigrants in removal proceedings. We have some aggregate data with some appropriate protections, of course. So we have mapped where people are facing removal, facing deportation in immigration court. One of the interesting things that came out of that was actually, if you look at the numbers relative to population, the Great Plains, the Midwest, actually has quite large numbers of, again, relative, a large percentage of people in many of those counties in western Oklahoma, northern Texas, Iowa, Nebraska, who are facing deportation. So there's actually rural communities where the population immigrants facing deportation are higher than some of the coastal counties. We also track the asylum grant and denial rate by immigration judges. This was very controversial when we first did it, because what judge wants to have all of their dirty laundry aired? But in fact, the judges love it now, because the judges don't know what's going on in the courtroom next to them. So I talk to judges all the time who are like, "Oh, this is great. I can see what the guy next to me is doing." We just updated the immigration judge data using, again, the same data set. We added 97 new judges to the report, so you can go in and see what some of these new judges are doing. We track detention data. Immigrant detention numbers are back up to Trump era numbers now. They're around 40,000 as of November 5th, so about 10 days ago, which is concerning. We track the number of immigrants who come to ports of entry, who are what are called inadmissible. They're not allowed into the country for various reasons. And so again, sorry that the bottom is cut off here. But it's interesting to see how the composition of nationality varies by different port. So you can actually see, Russian migrants, refugees, asylum seekers predominantly went to that's San Diego over there on the far left, whereas Venezuelan and Haitian asylum seekers predominantly came to the east side of the border in South Texas, Matamoros, Reynosa. And we do some other stuff too. We find all kinds of issues with government data, which we then write about and try to hold the government's feet to the fire. They mess up data. Sometimes they conceal things. Sometimes they lose data, which is a major problem because there's all kinds of laws about government agencies not deleting records. And we found evidence of agencies possibly deleting records. And of course, sometimes they just get their basic math wrong. And of course, we have to call them out for that. Because of all of this, we have a pretty large impact in the news media, academic research, and policy making. So we're often asked to comment on things in congressional hearings, things like that, which is fun to do work that feels like people are paying attention to. And recently cited a major amicus brief for a major Supreme Court case that's coming up. So I would just say in closing that doing research on closed institutions can't be entirely fixed using this method, but it can be improved by the strategic and persistent use of FOIA. We've got more stuff coming out next week, so watch for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Would you like me to call on people, or would you like to take your phone? Okay, I'll take it.
Yeah, sure. All right, hard questions, please.
Hi, I'm Sofia Ayala. I'm a CSD research scientist and also director of the Northwest Federal Statistical Research Data Center here at the university. Yeah, no, thank you for giving this presentation. I'm wondering, are the data that you receive de-identified, and also how do you guarantee privacy?
Sure. So the question is about de-identification. Does the data come with personally identifiable information? Short answer is no. Anything that comes out of FOIA has to be de-identified through the exemption process from the beginning. So we don't have any personal identifying information. And the closest we would even have to this, and I'm sure you're well aware of this issue, is a certain combination of demographic characteristics locatable within a specific geographic unit, right? So when I was very happy that the UR accepted my argument to give us zip code data, we also, of course, had a conversation about at what point there's de-identification. So if a certain zip code has less than, and I can't remember what the cutoff is, but they're not going to give us data on one person in the zip code. They're going to de-identify if it's fewer than a certain number.
So they give you,
Yeah,
they control they give you standards for review.
exactly.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Lubna. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. I'm from Pakistan and I just came here like 3 years ago and I've experienced some stuff. So I started studying how does information seeking practices of Muslims in US are affected by their concerns around surveillance, because I've gone through that experience where you have to share a lot of information just to get visas to get to US. And if you're coming from like Pakistan or a Muslim majority country, then you're put through a lot of checks even during travel and throughout. So based on that, I've started looking into that. And so you did mention like anybody can get access to data regardless of nationality. And I've been thinking about this, but my question to you is that's like a maybe theoretically, but what are your what's your take on is it possible for somebody who's coming from outside, like you have 5 years to get your doctorate and you're just figuring this out as a research area? And realistically speaking, you have a different nationality that's like has a lot of it's like countries being looked very critically within the US generally. So realistically speaking, what does this look like for researchers to get access? Like theoretically, maybe anybody can, but do you have experiences working with researchers who are actually immigrants, that like non-immigrants themselves?
So it's a great question. The question is about access. Like, really, can just anyone get access to this stuff through FOIA? I would say there's probably two barriers. One is it's a little bit hard to imagine doing a large project and not being connected to resources in an institution of some kind, whether that's an institution of higher ed, an NGO, something like that. So that's one just general barrier. And the other is all of the other expertise that's involved in this. I haven't talked to a lot of people outside the United States. Well, I've never talked to anyone outside the United States who's not a researcher who's tried to use FOIA from outside the United States. I'm sure it exists. I just haven't come across it. But I do know researchers in Europe who have filed FOIA requests. There is a I have a sense that those FOIA requests are practically treated differently, with some of them just kind of being ignored. The issue is the government ignores so many FOIA requests. It's kind of hard to know, like, is that a product of a general thing? But I do think if you're interested in research and you're interested in this kind of work, there are folks like us who work with graduate students and academic researchers, and there's other organizations who have data. So I would say to someone coming new into it, one of the ways to save yourself a lot of time, and I always encourage graduate students to do this, is send FOIA requests yourself, because you'll learn a lot in the process and you'll see, but partner up with people who have already done it and have some data. So there's a lot of folks out here, there's folks in the room who are working with data that they've gotten through FOIA, and that saves you a lot of time. I will say, just as a final note, because you were talking basically about consular processing, through the Department of State does that kind of processing. The Department of State is the hardest agency to get anything from. So I don't know if this was part of your question, but if you want to study the process, I mean, I would love to know, for instance, how applicants from Muslim majority countries are treated by the consular processing process. The question would be, getting anything out of the Department of State is just the same. It's very difficult. Yeah, it's a good question though. Yes.
Amazing talk and amazing work. Thank you. Sorry, Steve Goodrow. I'm a professor here at I'm used to reading the New York Times, seeing how this kind of work is done by NGOs all the time. Seeing it being done at such a scale within an academic institution is surprising and amazing. And so I guess I'm wondering the logistics of that. How does your university, like, this is it feels so different from what most faculty do. So how does your university see this? It sounds like there was a setting up process, but
yeah,
where does the money come from? How did you convince them that the risk and the notoriety and the government
Oh, I'm not sure we have.
And then
I don't
also,
think we-
where does the money come?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a good question. So we have multiple funding streams. We're basically under a sponsored program model. So we run on grants and funding and some other soft money, basically. And so that's our relationship with the university. We're pretty independently funded, but we've been pretty successful at, keeping the balance sheet in the right direction. We're not huge, but we're okay. And as far as the university politics is tough because they don't like the fact that we're suing agencies that they're trying to get grants from. Like we're suing DHS while they're trying to get money for their veterans center or something like that. So that's a challenge, and they don't want to say that they would lean on us, but like there's it makes them uncomfortable. We also do some I don't do it, but my colleague Sue does a lot of IRS work. She's been doing it for years, and we create news. So the university likes the fact that every time they mention TRAC, they mention TRAC at Syracuse University. So we're like 25% of all the media coverage for the university just comes from us. One random year, and this is like a weird thing to say, but I was like the second most cited professor at the university one year, just so I was doing a bunch of media stuff. You know what I mean? It's not what I seek to do, but it's like it was like weird. So we generate a lot of media attention for it, but then we also we call us DHS Secretary Mayorkas when they screw things up. Like we've directly contradicted the IRS. I don't know if it's secretary, but whatever, the guy that runs the IRS for making false statements to Congress. So the university doesn't like getting a call from the IRS saying, why are your professors going to the media and saying that we're lying? So there's that tension.
There's a couple questions online.
Yes, please.
Okay. One of them is from Audrey Hudgens, and actually, I think we could even get Audrey to allow to talk. Okay. I think you should be able to ask your question, Audrey.
Hi, there might be a tremendous amount of background noise, so I'm sorry, I'm walking while I'm doing this. I'm curious about data on Indigenous immigrants, both status and experience of Indigenous folks in the system. And so I don't know if that's a marker that's part of the database, but I'm curious about Indigenous. Thank you.
I'm gonna hold you. There's another
Yeah.
question, and I'll let. So Jenny, I'm gonna let you ask your question too. Jenny Romick.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I'm also walking. I'm also really interested on this question as well. But I'm super impressed by how much you do with this small team. And I'd love it if you could speak to kind of how your workflows have evolved over time and what are the secret sauce ingredients for being able to do this much work so efficiently. Thanks. Great talk.
Thanks.
Add something to the first question. In terms of the data, are people classified by country of citizenship? How does that account for the different racial breakdowns and ethnicities of different migrants?
Any others? We're good?
No.
Okay, I'll start with the workflows one. We just don't sleep. That's our secret strategy. It's just work 24/7. No, it's like I said, we really try to capitalize on the technology that we have. So we don't do anything once that we won't do 1,000 times. And this is actually a principle of what we do, at the core of what we do. So when we get a new data source of some kind, we're building in. I showed you the detention data, so we monitor detention statistics. Well, we have a program that when the federal government releases new detention data, we put it into a program and check it a bunch of different ways. We check it against itself, make sure it's okay. We take the data that the government is publishing and we produce summary tables automatically from it that allow us to write faster and all of that stuff. So we do things like that it takes a little bit on the front end, but then once you have it in place, things actually work quite quickly. And we also just specialize. I was having this conversation with some colleagues in Toronto a couple months ago, and the key is specialization. I mean, we know what we do. we do what we do pretty well, and we keep doing that thing, and then we carefully and strategically expand when we can. But that's really key. You know, I think to do anything like this. I think we do a lot, but I also think if you could see how it developed over time, you could probably see how things, you know, we're running on some code that was written by graduate students in the early 2000s. We're still running on some of that code, you know what I mean? So we really try to make that investment really count. I think that's key. And just having a division of labor where people really know what they're doing is you can do so much with a small team that's really competent, really experts in each of what they do, than a larger team where everyone's like always trying to sort things out.
Are you can you stop sharing so people can see your?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. How's that?
Good.
Okay. So I love the question about Indigenous people in the system, and this is actually one of my favorite things I've done in the last year or year and a half. So there's lots of questions right now, especially after the very visible violent treatment of Haitian asylum seekers along the U.S.-Mexico border about 2 years ago. Maybe you remember the Border Patrol on horseback and that, right? So that's become even more of a question that we get more regularly. And the reality is that the immigration court data itself does not report race. Some of the other agencies sometimes record race of questionable reliability because it's predominantly Border Patrol officers themselves filling things out rather than self-reported. So that creates some challenges, although there's some useful stuff in there. So there is a big discussion around a couple things. One is nationality, which is a great point. Can we use nationality to infer race? And that, of course, depends a bit on the questions you're asking and the nationality you're looking at, because some countries are more racially diverse than others. I work with an organization called Haitian Bridge Alliance, which predominantly works with Black and Haitian and African migrants along the border. They're pretty comfortable with, for instance, saying Haitian, migrants who are from Haiti, Haitian migrants, Haitian asylum seekers, probably Black. We're pretty comfortable with that. There's others obviously like Mexico. Mexico is a very multiracial, very diverse kind of country. There's also a lot of colorism and racism there. So that doesn't really, what does that mean? So I think it sort of depends on the project at hand and the people who are involved. We don't make any inferences about that. I don't think we're comfortable doing that, but some people have. However, this is what got me really interested in looking at language. Turns out that we had gotten this data forever and had never done anything with it. And when I found out that we had data on language for people who are in immigration court, I was like, we got to get that out. Let's have a look at it. So we looked at it, we validated it, we felt pretty comfortable, and now we release it. Now we have language on everything, which a lot of indigenous language speakers from Central America are still misidentifying as Spanish language speakers. We know that. However, it has indigenous languages in there. So it doesn't have indigenous language or indigenous identity as a self-reported identity, but that's a good example of if we can say, okay, they're from Guatemala, they speak this language. We have a good idea, maybe geographically where they're from, and maybe we can make some inferences about identity. It's not perfect, but it gets us somewhere, and that's as close as we've gotten to indigeneity, I would say.
And another question, but
Thanks. Thank you.
Want me to? Let's see. Sorry. We also have 2 questions in the back. Okay, why don't you ask the questions in the back and I'll get the other person.
Right, you say you do a lot of validation and you kind of swept over that, but I'm curious what that, I'm a statistician by training.
Yeah.
So what does that look like when you don't know what you're looking for?
If we don't know what we're looking for, we're probably still at the exploratory phase. Once we know what we're looking for, even messy stuff, we kind of know what we're doing. I'll just give you a very concrete example. For a while, the numbers of immigrants who are monitored using electronic monitoring, so smartphones, ankle monitors, a couple different technologies. These are migrants who are not in detention. They're waiting for their immigration hearing, but they're living with their families, something like that. So those numbers were really spiking. they're really going up every single week across the country, and I was following this very closely. Several times, Immigration and Customs Enforcement published public data that either the total numbers would suddenly drop 20%, right? Or I would also do it geographically because they have some geographic indicators. And I just remember once, like I dug into it, and it was like Washington D.C. went from having like 5,000 people enrolled in this program to like 300, then back to 5,500 2 weeks later. It's like, okay, that's a data error, you know. So there's internal validation and trends kinds of things that we do like that. For instance, this has happened. Because we get new data every month, you're never going to have fewer asylum cases this month than you had last month. Some cases are going to close out, but they're still going to be in the system, right? So we've actually found cases where like, oh, we've got, let's say 1 million asylum cases in the system, and then we get new data and there's 750,000. So what happened to 250,000? So that's one example. The other example so that's like internal validation. External validation, we just say, okay, they produce data that says there's, you know, this many people. We go and look at other reports, other public reports, and other public statements. That tends to come in more of the exploratory phase, where we're getting something for the first time and saying, okay, they're saying there's this many people in detention, let's say, is it plausible? Does it make sense given what we know about the system and the capacity of the system, and how does it compare to other public statements? It's kind of some examples.
We only have 4 minutes left, so maybe we can collect the questions and then cheers one.
That was exactly my question.
Okay.
No, right?
Yeah.
So
We have an online question, but I'm just gonna go ahead and ask it on behalf of Maggie Wilson, who says, thanks for a great talk. Are you able to access data on inadmissibility on medical health related grounds?
Oh,
I don't know if there's
one more question.
I was gonna ask, was there any efforts like linking to other data, not necessarily personal, but like maybe small geography level to see like what's in, what's not, how to aggregate for like future research?
yeah, both good questions. So on inadmissibility, there isn't an inadmissibility. Is there an inadmissibility ground for health related research thing? I think that there is a kind of infectious disease ground of inadmissibility that's extremely rarely used, but we do have that data online, so you can go in and you can see in detail exactly what the inadmissibility category is. I haven't looked into that in particular. You might be referring to, and I don't know, you might be referring to the humanitarian exemptions for medical circumstances, in which case there is a category for even if someone is inadmissible, there's also categories for why people might be allowed into the country. And so some people who have severe medical conditions, even if they aren't technically don't have the paperwork to enter the country, they still may fall under a humanitarian classification and be allowed in for medical reasons. So whichever side of that the question is coming from, all the data is on our website. And if you just look for TRAC inadmissibility, you should find it. As far as linking it to other data, we always want to find ways to link up different data sets. It's extremely difficult to do. Even if you think about like, oh, birth date and nationality, well, actually that's even not enough in many cases. So we try to do that. We don't spend a whole lot of time doing that, but we do work with researchers who use our data and spend more time on that than we do. And I think there's certainly possibility there. One of the biggest things, with this scale of data with the immigration courts and the geographic identifiers is you can do a lot with census data and other kinds of indicators. You can look and see, poverty, housing, enforcement. So all kinds of indicators people have used to tie together with some of this data to do some really interesting things. I suppose I would say, as a general matter, we kind of have enough to do with the data that we get that we don't really bring in outside data. But again, we love it when people do, and we work with people who do.
We've got 1 minute left. Anyone has a quick question?
Yeah, I have a personal question. How do you take care of your mental health, especially doing a lot of dealing with a lot of sensitive information, doing qualitative as well as quantitative data? So how do you take care of that? How do you manage that, especially with a lot of political turmoil, which will increase, especially with the new presidential candidates and Republicans and Democrats and all that? So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, mental health is a great question, and that's true in this field, like, you know, whatever you're doing, there's no question. It has to be a priority. I guess there's two things, for me, I guess I get so energized by when things amp up that I feel enormous. I know this is not supposed to be the right answer, but I feel, you know, here's something some people are driven more by happiness and some people are driven more by purpose. I tend to be the kind of person who's driven really by purpose. I feel worse, even if nothing bad is happening, if I'm not doing anything that feels fulfilling. So in a sense, I derive a lot of purpose from this because I care deeply about the work. And so as things amp up, you know, I do feel, but that again, that introduces mental health. Like, how do you sustain yourself? And for me, it's stepping away. Literature, poetry, and art is, I mean, I go to an art museum as often as I can. I spend time, I read something that's, you know, that's not just about data and tragedy as much as possible. And, you know, like hanging out with people who like actually value you and like will who like know you and like will ask you for real, like, you know, how are you doing? Like this kind of question, that kind of question is like a great, like the question itself is actually a good practice of mental health, asking each other, like, how are we doing? You know, so that's really good.
What a lovely
Yeah, so very
note
nice.
to end on.
Read poetry.
Thank you all for being here today. We are about to wrap up, but before I invite you to clap for Austin, I just want to quickly announce that the grad students are staying afterwards. If you're a grad student and you're interested in having some time to pick his brain, please stay afterwards. Say that again?
And pizza.
And pizza, and pizza. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Professor.